The moment I started counting was the moment I realized the problem had never been a joke. I was 72 years old when that thought first crossed my mind. It happened during what was supposed to be a pleasant Sunday family gathering at my son Ethan's house. The backyard was full of people. Neighbors chatted near the grill. My granddaughter Olivia was helping arrange drinks on a folding table. Children ran across the lawn while classic rock played softly through outdoor speakers. From the outside, everything looked like a perfect American family afternoon. I remember standing near the patio holding a paper plate and listening to conversations drift through the crowd. That was when Ethan made another comment. At first, everyone laughed. Ethan laughed too. The people around him smiled politely. A few even nodded. It sounded harmless if you did not know the history behind it. "Do not ask Dad for advice," Ethan joked loudly. The last time he understood modern life, gas was under $1 a gallon. More laughter followed. I forced a smile. I had done that many times before. But this time something felt different. As the laughter faded, I suddenly remembered another comment from months earlier. Then another. Then another. The memories arrived one after another like files being pulled from a cabinet I had kept closed for years. I stood there quietly while everyone returned to their conversations. Nobody noticed the change in me. Nobody saw what was happening inside my head. For the first time, I started connecting the moments together. Not one joke. Not one awkward comment. A pattern. A long pattern stretching across years. I sat down alone at a corner table and watched my family. Ethan moved easily through the crowd. People listened when he spoke. Melissa smiled beside him. Olivia laughed with her friends. Everything looked normal. Yet I could not stop replaying old conversations. The time Ethan dismissed my opinion during Thanksgiving. The time he joked about my age in front of relatives. The time he rolled his eyes when I offered help. The time he introduced me as the family historian. Because according to him, I remembered events from ancient civilization. Every memory had seemed small when it happened. Every memory had been easy to excuse. I had told myself he was stressed, busy, distracted. But sitting there that afternoon, I realized something uncomfortable. If one person accidentally hurts your feelings once, it is probably a mistake. If it happens over and over again, it becomes a choice. Later that evening, after everyone left, I drove home alone. The road was quiet. The sun was beginning to set. I kept thinking about that comment by the grill. Not because it was especially cruel. In fact, it was one of the milder ones. What bothered me was what it represented. When I arrived home, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen table. Then I did something I had never done before. I took out a legal pad and wrote a single number at the top of the page. Number 13. Underneath it, I wrote the comment Ethan had made that afternoon. Then I sat back and stared at the page. Why 13? Because as I reviewed the memories in my mind, I realized that was exactly where the count had landed. 13 separate moments. 13 public remarks. 13 times I had been reduced to a punchline, while everyone else pretended it was harmless. The realization left me staring at the page for several minutes. What shocked me most was not Ethan's behavior. It was the fact that I had allowed myself to normalize it. Then another thought entered my mind. If I had finally noticed the pattern, what else had I failed to notice? I looked at the list again. 13 moments. 13 warnings. And deep down, I had the strange feeling that those 13 entries were only the beginning of a much larger story. The next morning, the legal pad was still sitting on my kitchen table exactly where I had left it. The number 13 stared back at me like a question I could no longer ignore. I poured a cup of coffee and sat down beside it. For several minutes, I simply looked at the list. Then I began adding details. Dates when I could remember them. Locations. Who was present. What was said. The process took hours. What surprised me was how easy it became once I started. Memory after memory surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. The barbecue joke had been the 13th. Before that came a comment during Olivia's birthday party when Ethan laughed about how I still printed directions instead of using my phone. Everyone chuckled. I had smiled along with them. Before that came Thanksgiving when he interrupted me halfway through a story and announced that nobody needed a history lesson. Before that came a family vacation where he joked that I was the reason travel insurance existed. Each moment seemed small on its own. Together, they painted a picture I had never wanted to see. By the end of the afternoon, I realized something even more troubling. The comments had changed over time. Years ago, they had been occasional. Then they became regular. Eventually, they became expected. People no longer reacted because everyone had grown accustomed to them. including me. That realization hurt more than the comments themselves. A few days later, I attended one of Olivia's school events. As parents and grandparents gathered in the auditorium, I found myself watching people differently. I noticed how families spoke to one another. I noticed the respect in certain conversations. I noticed how often simple appreciation appeared in ordinary interactions. During the drive home, I could not stop comparing those moments to my own situation. When had respect quietly disappeared from my relationship with Ethan? More importantly, why had I allowed it? That evening, my phone rang. It was Ethan. The conversation began the way many of our conversations did. He asked how I was doing. Then within minutes, he shifted toward a problem involving a home project. He wanted my opinion on a contractor. I listened carefully, not because I was interested in contractors, because I was interested in the pattern. The entire call lasted nearly 20 minutes. When it ended, I realized something strange. Ethan never once asked about my life. Not my plans. Not my health. Not anything personal. The conversation revolved entirely around his needs. After hanging up, I opened a notebook and wrote down a simple observation. Most communication begins with a request. Seeing the sentence on paper unsettled me. I did not want it to be true. Over the next 2 weeks, I started paying attention to every interaction. Text messages, phone calls, family gatherings, invitations. The pattern repeated itself with remarkable consistency. When someone needed advice, they called. When someone needed help, they called. When someone needed support, they called. But conversations that existed solely because people enjoyed my company were surprisingly rare. One evening, while reviewing old emails, I discovered a thread involving a family trip plan for later that year. As I read through the messages, I noticed something that made me stop scrolling. Several expenses had already been assigned. Certain contributions were already assumed. Nobody had asked me whether I wanted to participate. The expectation simply existed. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. For years, I had mistaken dependence for connection. Now I was beginning to wonder how much of our relationship would remain if the assumptions disappeared. As that question settled into my mind, I looked again at the list of 13 moments. For the first time, I realized those remarks were not the actual problem. They were symptoms. The real problem was much larger, and I had only just begun uncovering it. Over the next month, I became an observer in my own family. I stopped rushing to fill every silence. I stopped volunteering solutions before anyone asked. Most importantly, I stopped explaining away things that made me uncomfortable. The effect was immediate. Once I began paying attention, patterns appeared everywhere. One Saturday morning, Melissa called and asked whether I could review estimates for a landscaping project. 2 days later, Ethan called to discuss insurance questions. A week after that, he asked if I knew anyone who could help with a property issue. None of those requests were unreasonable. In fact, any father would probably be happy to help. What caught my attention was what happened before and after those conversations. Before the request, there was often very little contact. After the request was resolved, communication usually faded again. I started keeping notes. Not because I wanted evidence against anyone. Because I wanted clarity for myself. Every interaction went into a small notebook. Date, topic, reason for contact. What I discovered surprised me. Nearly every conversation revolved around a need, a problem, a favor, or a decision. Very few revolved around connection. One evening, I decided to test a theory. Instead of waiting for someone to call, I reached out myself. I called Ethan on a Tuesday evening. When he answered, he sounded distracted. We talked for a few minutes about the weather and local news. Then there was a pause. Finally, he asked, "So what is up?" The question itself was harmless, but it revealed something important. He assumed there must be a reason for my call. A purpose, a problem, a request. When I told him I was simply checking in, he seemed almost surprised. After we ended the conversation, I sat quietly in my living room thinking about that reaction. Somewhere along the way, ordinary connection had become unusual. A few days later, I attended one of Olivia's soccer games. I arrived early and found a seat in the bleachers. Parents chatted nearby while players warmed up on the field. Olivia waved when she spotted me. Her smile was genuine, uncomplicated. During halftime, she came over and sat beside me for several minutes. We talked about school, her friends, and her plans for the summer. Not once did she ask me for anything. Not once did she need advice or assistance. She simply enjoyed the conversation. As I drove home later that afternoon, I realized why I enjoyed spending time with her so much. She treated me like a person rather than a resource. That realization stayed with me. Around the same time, I began reviewing old family emails, calendars, and messages. I wanted to know whether my recent observations reflected reality or merely my own emotions. The answer became impossible to ignore. Holiday planning often included assumptions about what I would contribute. Vacation discussions included expectations before invitations. Home improvement projects sometimes referenced help I had never formally agreed to provide. Nobody was demanding anything directly. That was what made it so subtle. The assumptions were built into the foundation of every plan. One evening, while looking through an email chain about an upcoming family trip, I noticed something that stopped me cold. A budget spreadsheet had already allocated a contribution under my name. No one had asked. No one had confirmed. The numbers simply existed as though it were automatic. I stared at the screen for several minutes. Then I opened my notebook and wrote a sentence that would change everything. They do not see support as a gift anymore. They see it as part of the plan. The moment I wrote those words, something clicked into place. The 13 comments suddenly made more sense. Respect had faded at the same pace that expectations had grown. And for the first time, I began asking a question that felt both painful and necessary. If I stopped saying yes to everything, what would remain of these relationships? The answer frightened me enough that I could not sleep that night. But deep down, I already knew I needed to find out. The question stayed with me for several days. If I stopped saying yes to everything, what would remain of these relationships? The more I thought about it, the more I realized there was only one way to find out. I needed to stop operating on assumptions. For years, everyone else had been making assumptions about me. Now it was time for me to stop making assumptions about them. One Monday morning, I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook, a cup of coffee, and a stack of documents I had not reviewed in months. Some were financial records. Some were long-term plans. Some were commitments I had quietly agreed to over the years. Looking through them felt strange. I had always viewed these plans as expressions of love, support for family, help when needed, a safety net. But now I looked at them through a different lens. Not one of generosity, but one of expectation. How many of these commitments existed because people appreciated them? And how many existed because people expected them? The question followed me throughout the week. Then something happened that pushed me closer to an answer. Ethan called on Thursday afternoon. After a few minutes of casual conversation, he brought up a renovation project he and Melissa had been discussing. He explained the timeline, the contractor, and the budget. Then he said something that immediately caught my attention. We should be able to make it work as long as everything goes according to plan. I asked a simple question. What happens if it does not? There was a brief pause. Well, Ethan replied, there are always backup options. His answer sounded normal, but I knew my son well enough to recognize hesitation when I heard it. A few more questions revealed what he was not saying directly. Part of those backup options involved me, not because we had discussed it, not because I had agreed to it, simply because he assumed I would be there if necessary. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. Then I opened my notebook and wrote another sentence. They are planning with resources that are not theirs. Seeing those words on paper felt different, clearer, more precise. For the first time, I could identify the real issue. It was not the 13 comments. It was not even the lack of respect. The deeper problem was entitlement. Not malicious entitlement. Not intentional cruelty. The kind that grows slowly over many years when people become accustomed to help arriving whenever they need it. The following weekend, I attended another family gathering. This one was smaller. Just Ethan, Melissa, Olivia, and me. Throughout the evening, I paid attention to the conversations. The future came up repeatedly. Summer vacations, home improvements, college plans, financial goals. Every discussion contained assumptions about how life would unfold. As I listened, I realized something surprising. My role appeared in many of those future plans, but my opinions rarely did. People discussed outcomes involving me without actually involving me. Nobody meant harm. That was what made it so difficult to recognize. Yet the pattern was there. By the time I returned home that night, my mind was made up. The next step was not emotional. It was practical. On Monday morning, I called Charles Reed. Charles had been my attorney and trusted advisor for many years. He answered on the second ring. After exchanging greetings, I asked whether he had time to meet later that week. Of course, he said. Is everything all right? I looked out my kitchen window before answering. I think I finally understand a few things I should have understood a long time ago. Charles laughed softly. That sounds serious. It is, I replied, but not in the way you think. We scheduled a meeting for Friday afternoon. After hanging up, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not anger. Not resentment. Relief. Because for the first time since I started counting those 13 moments, I was no longer focused on what had happened. I was focused on what needed to happen next. And as Friday approached, I had a feeling that one conversation inside Charles Reed's office was about to change the future of my family in ways none of us could yet imagine. Friday arrived with cold rain and gray skies. I left home early and drove across town to Charles Reed's office. The building itself was familiar. I had walked through those doors many times over the years for routine planning, paperwork, and occasional legal questions. This visit felt different. When Charles greeted me, he immediately noticed it. You look like a man who has made up his mind, he said as we shook hands. I think I finally have, I replied. We settled into his conference room, and he opened a thick folder containing years of documents. Retirement plans, estate documents, financial arrangements, long-term commitments. Everything was neatly organized. Looking at the stack of papers felt almost surreal. Every page represented decisions made with family in mind. Every signature reflected trust. Charles reviewed several sections before looking up. What exactly would you like to discuss? He asked. For a moment, I simply stared at the folder. Then I told him the truth. I explained the 13 comments. The notebook. The growing realization that respect had slowly disappeared while expectations had quietly expanded. Charles listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, he folded his hands and sat back in his chair. George, he said carefully, are you angry? The question surprised me. I thought about it for several seconds. No, I answered. I was angry at first. Now I think I am disappointed. Charles nodded slowly. Disappointment tends to last longer. That observation stayed with me. Together we spent the next 2 hours reviewing every major plan connected to my future. The more we talked, the clearer things became. I had built much of my planning around assumptions. Assumptions that certain relationships would always remain healthy. Assumptions that mutual respect existed. Assumptions that support would continue flowing in one direction because appreciation flowed in the other. Looking back, many of those assumptions no longer reflected reality. You are allowed to adjust your plans, Charles reminded me. People often forget that. He was right. Somewhere along the way, I had started treating old decisions as permanent obligations. They were not obligations. They were choices. That distinction changed everything. By the end of the meeting, several significant revisions had been made. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Just thoughtful changes based on present circumstances instead of outdated expectations. When I signed the final document, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not guilt. Not regret. Relief. As I walked out of Charles's office, the rain had stopped. Sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. For the first time in months, my mind felt quiet. The following week brought an interesting development. Ethan called on Tuesday evening. After discussing a few routine topics, he mentioned the renovation project again. This time he sounded concerned. Construction costs had increased. Several unexpected expenses had appeared. He talked through the numbers for nearly 15 minutes. Then came the moment I had anticipated. We may need to adjust a few things, he said carefully, depending on how everything works out. I listened without commenting. Then he added something else. I assumed there would be flexibility if things got tight. Assumed. There was that word again. It seemed to appear everywhere. I asked a simple question. Why would you assume that? Silence filled the line. Not an uncomfortable silence. A surprised one. It was as though nobody had ever challenged the assumption before. Ethan eventually answered. Because that is how it has always worked. After we ended the call, I sat alone in my living room thinking about his response. That is how it has always worked. Not because we discussed it. Not because we agreed to it. Simply because it had become normal. For years, my support had been treated like part of the landscape. Always present. Always available. But landscapes can change. And for the first time, I realized that the changes Charles and I had made were about far more than documents. They were about forcing everyone, including myself, to see reality clearly. What I did not know yet was how quickly those changes would begin affecting the rest of the family. And when they did, the reactions would reveal far more than the 13 comments ever had. The reactions started appearing sooner than I expected. At first they were subtle. A few extra phone calls. A few unusual questions. Small signs that something had shifted beneath the surface. One evening, Melissa called and asked whether I had time to talk. Her tone was polite, but there was a level of concern I had not heard before. We spoke for nearly half an hour. The conversation wandered through ordinary topics before eventually arriving at what was really on her mind. "George," she said carefully, "have you changed some of your plans recently?" I smiled to myself. The question had finally arrived. "What makes you ask?" There was a brief pause. "People have noticed that you seem different." Different. It was interesting how often that word appeared whenever someone stopped behaving according to expectations. I answered honestly. "I have been doing a lot of thinking." Melissa seemed uncertain how to respond. Before ending the call, she said something that stayed with me. "I do not think Ethan realizes how much things have changed." After we hung up, I sat quietly in my study and considered her words. The truth was that I did not think Ethan realized it either. For years, life had followed a predictable pattern. Needs appeared. Support appeared. Problems appeared. Solutions appeared. Nobody questioned the system because the system always worked. The following weekend, I received proof that the system was beginning to crack. Ethan called late Saturday morning. He sounded frustrated. Several unexpected expenses had emerged during the renovation project. Timelines were slipping. Costs were increasing. The conversation felt familiar until he reached the part where he expected reassurance. Instead of offering solutions, I listened. Instead of volunteering help, I asked questions. "What options are you considering?" I asked. Ethan sounded surprised. "I am still trying to figure that out." "Then that seems like the place to start," I replied. Silence followed. Not hostile silence. Confused silence. The kind that appears when an old pattern suddenly stops working. After the call ended, I wrote another note in my notebook. The expectation remains even when the support does not. A few days later, Olivia stopped by after school. Unlike the adults, she never seemed to carry hidden agendas into conversations. She sat at my kitchen table eating cookies while telling me about a school project. Eventually, she asked a question that caught me off guard. "Grandpa, are you upset with Dad?" I looked at her carefully. "Why do you ask?" She shrugged. "Because everybody seems nervous lately. Children often notice more than adults realize." I chose my words carefully. "I am not upset. I am just trying to make sure people understand each other better." Olivia nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds complicated." I laughed softly. "Sometimes it is." After she left, I found myself thinking about how simple the situation looked through her eyes. People were nervous because something familiar had changed. The following Friday, Ethan showed up at my house without calling first. That alone was unusual. When I opened the door, I immediately recognized the expression on his face. It was the same expression I had seen many times throughout my career when someone realized a problem was larger than they first believed. We sat down in the living room. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan leaned forward. "Dad, I need to ask you something." His voice was serious. "Go ahead." He hesitated before continuing. "Have you been pulling away from the family?" The question hung in the air between us. I thought about it carefully before answering. "No," I said. "I think I have been pulling away from assumptions." Ethan stared at me. For the first time since this entire process began, I could see genuine uncertainty in his eyes. Not annoyance. Not defensiveness. Uncertainty. And as the silence stretched across the room, I realized we had finally arrived at the conversation I had been expecting from the very beginning. For several seconds after I answered, neither of us spoke. Ethan sat across from me staring at the coffee table as though he was trying to solve a problem that had no easy solution. Finally, he looked up. "What does that even mean?" he asked. I leaned back in my chair. "It means I spent a long time confusing expectations with relationships." Ethan frowned. "I still do not understand." I stood and walked into my study. When I returned, I carried the notebook that had been sitting on my desk for months. I placed it between us. Ethan glanced at it, but did not reach for it. "What is that?" he asked. "A record," I said, "of things I should have paid attention to much sooner." His expression tightened. Slowly, I opened the notebook. The first pages contained dates and observations. The later pages contained something else. 13 entries. 13 moments. 13 comments. I turned the notebook toward him. "Read them." Ethan hesitated before taking it. The room remained silent except for the turning of pages. I watched his expression change as he moved through the list. At first he looked confused, then uncomfortable, then increasingly quiet. Several minutes passed before he finally reached the last page. He closed the notebook and stared at it without speaking. "I was joking," he said eventually. I nodded. "I know. I never meant any of it." Again, I nodded. "I know that too." Ethan looked frustrated. "Then why are we sitting here talking about this?" That question told me everything. He still believed the issue was the comments themselves. "Because the comments are not the point," I replied. "They are evidence." He looked at me carefully. "Evidence of what?" I took a slow breath. "Evidence that respect slowly disappeared from our relationship and neither of us noticed." Ethan looked away. Outside, afternoon sunlight filtered through the living room window. The house felt unusually quiet. "Dad, everybody jokes with each other." "That is true. So why does this feel different?" I answered immediately. "Because every joke moved in one direction." That stopped him. "What do you mean? Can you remember a time when you built me up in front of everyone the way you tore me down?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Can you remember a time when you introduced me by talking about my strengths instead of making me the punchline?" Silence. "Can you remember a time when the room laughed because you were proud of me?" Ethan lowered his eyes. I was not trying to embarrass him. I was simply describing reality. After several moments, he spoke quietly. "I never thought about it that way." "That is the problem," I replied gently. "You never thought about it at all." The words hung in the air between us. For the first time since this conversation began, Ethan did not defend himself. He simply listened. I could see memories moving behind his eyes. Thanksgiving dinners, birthday parties, family vacations. Countless moments he had probably forgotten the second they ended. Moments I remembered because I was the one standing at the receiving end. Eventually, he looked back at the notebook. 13 times, he said softly. "Those are only the ones I wrote down," I answered. Ethan exhaled slowly. The confidence he had arrived with was gone now. In its place stood something much more important. Awareness. "I honestly thought everyone was laughing with us," he said. "Maybe they were," I replied. But I was not. The room fell silent again. This time the silence felt different. Not tense. Reflective. Ethan stared at the notebook for nearly a minute before finally speaking. "I think I owe you an apology." I shook my head. "An apology is a start. Understanding is more important." He nodded slowly. Then he asked a question I had been waiting months to hear. "How long have you been carrying this?" I looked at the notebook resting between us. Much longer than I should have. And judging by the expression on Ethan's face, he was only beginning to understand the weight of what that answer truly meant. After Ethan left that afternoon, I remained in the living room long after the front door closed behind him. The notebook still sat on the coffee table between two untouched cups of coffee. For months, those pages had existed only for me. They were private observations, private disappointments, private reminders that something in our relationship had slowly drifted off course. Now the truth was no longer mine alone. Ethan had seen it. He had read every entry. He had finally looked at the pattern instead of the individual moments. For the first time since I began writing those notes, I felt no desire to add another page. The following week was unusually quiet. No unexpected requests arrived. No discussions about projects. No conversations about budgets or plans. At first, the silence felt strange. Then it felt peaceful. Several days later, Melissa called and asked if I would join them for dinner on Sunday evening. Her voice sounded different. Softer somehow. More deliberate. I agreed. When Sunday arrived, I drove to their house carrying nothing but a small dessert from a local bakery. As soon as I walked through the front door, I sensed the atmosphere had changed. Nobody seemed rushed. Nobody seemed distracted. Olivia greeted me with a hug. Melissa welcomed me inside. Even Ethan appeared unusually nervous. We gathered around the dining room table shortly after sunset. The conversation began normally enough. School, work, community events, everyday topics. Yet beneath the surface, everyone seemed aware that something remained unfinished. Eventually, the silence arrived. The kind of silence families experience when an important conversation is waiting for permission to begin. Ethan was the first to speak. "I have been thinking about that notebook every day," he said quietly. Nobody interrupted him. "At first I was angry," he continued. "Not because of what was written, because I did not like what it said about me." He looked down at the table before continuing. "Then I started remembering things myself." The room remained completely still. I remembered Thanksgiving. I remembered Olivia's birthday. I remembered family vacations. I remembered all those comments. He paused. And for the first time, I tried hearing them from your side instead of mine. Melissa reached over and gently placed a hand on his arm. Ethan took a deep breath. I thought I was being funny. I thought everybody understood I was joking. What I never stopped to ask was whether the person I was joking about found it funny. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Olivia surprised all of us. I remember some of them too, she said quietly. Ethan looked at her. You do? She nodded. Sometimes I thought Grandpa looked uncomfortable. The honesty of that statement seemed to hit Ethan harder than anything else. Children rarely filter the truth. They simply say what they see. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Ethan turned toward me. I cannot change what happened, he said. But I can stop pretending it did not matter. Those words landed differently than an apology. They sounded like understanding. Real understanding. Not understanding because someone was caught. Understanding because someone finally saw the consequences of their actions. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours. Nobody argued. Nobody defended themselves. Instead, everyone talked honestly. Perhaps more honestly than we had in years. By the end of the evening, something important had happened. The focus was no longer on 13 comments. The focus was on what those comments revealed. Assumptions, complacency, a lack of appreciation that had slowly grown over time without anyone noticing. As I prepared to leave, Ethan walked me to my car. The night air was cool and quiet. Before I opened the driver's door, he stopped me. Dad, he said, I think I finally understand why everything changed. I looked at him carefully. Why? He nodded toward the house behind him. Because the problem was never the jokes. The problem was that we stopped treating you like a person and started treating you like a certainty. For the first time since this journey began, I felt certain that he truly understood. And sometimes understanding is the beginning of something far more powerful than an apology. The months that followed taught me something I had almost forgotten. Real change rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly through small choices repeated day after day. Summer slowly gave way to fall. The trees around town began turning shades of gold and red. Life moved forward, but it did not return to the way it had been before. In many ways, that was the best outcome possible. The old version of our family had depended on assumptions. The new version depended on awareness. Ethan called more often, but the calls felt different now. Sometimes he called just to tell me about a project at work. Sometimes he called to ask how my week had been. Occasionally, he called for no reason at all. The first few times it happened, I noticed it immediately because it felt unusual. Later, it started feeling normal. Melissa also changed in ways that were impossible to miss. Family dinners no longer revolved around plans, budgets, or future expectations. Instead, people seemed genuinely interested in being together. Even simple conversations felt lighter. The tension I had carried for years gradually disappeared without me realizing it. One Saturday afternoon, Olivia invited me to attend a school presentation. As I sat in the auditorium listening to her speak confidently in front of a crowd, I found myself smiling. Not because she delivered a perfect presentation, because she looked happy. Afterward, she ran over and hugged me before her friends could pull her away. I am glad you came, Grandpa, she said. Such a simple sentence. Yet it reminded me of something important. Relationships are built from moments like that. Not obligations. Not expectations. Moments. As the holidays approached again, I noticed something else. Nobody discussed plans as though my participation was guaranteed. Invitations were offered. Opinions were requested. Choices were respected. It was a small change on the surface, but it represented a completely different mindset. One evening in early December, Ethan stopped by my house carrying 2 cups of coffee. We sat on the back porch watching the sunset. For a while we talked about ordinary things. Then he grew quiet. You know, he said, staring out across the yard. I used to think your support was one of those things that would always be there no matter what. I nodded. I know. He smiled sadly. I never stopped to think about the person behind it. There was no defensiveness left in his voice. No excuses. Just honesty. We sat in silence for a moment before he continued. I am grateful you made me see it. I thought about everything that had happened over the previous year. The comments. The notebook. The difficult conversations. The uncomfortable truths. I did not do it to teach you a lesson, I said. I did it because I finally realized I needed to respect myself. Ethan nodded slowly. I think that is why it worked. A few weeks later, Our family gathered again for a holiday dinner. As I looked around the table, I noticed something remarkable. Nobody was trying to impress anyone. Nobody was competing for attention. Nobody was turning another person into a joke. People were simply enjoying each other's company. At one point, Olivia asked everyone to share something they appreciated about another family member. When it was Ethan's turn, he looked directly at me. "I appreciate my father," he said, "for teaching me that respect matters more than convenience." The room grew quiet. Not an uncomfortable silence, a meaningful one. I looked around the table and realized that the greatest payback had never been canceling plans or changing documents. The greatest payback was forcing the truth into the open. Because once everyone finally saw the truth, they had a chance to become better. And as laughter filled the room later that evening and the holiday lights reflected softly against the windows, I realized I was no longer counting painful moments. I was finally creating new ones worth remembering.